Vicbourne fans have dreamed of a marriage between Lord Melbourne and Queen Victoria, and especially with the couple's wedding night. The next are two fanfic scenes, imagining the wedding night of Lord Melbourne and Victoria. Scene 1. On the night, Victoria waited nervously in the honeymoon suite, dressed only in a semi-transparent nightgown, and barefoot. Victoria was wearing loose hair, which fell down to her shoulders. She remembered nervously her conversation with Miss Scarrat, and anxiously awaited what was about to happen. Victoria sat on the bed and got to her feet, walked a few steps in the bedroom and returned to the bed, not knowing what to do. She was standing again at the side of the bed, wringing her hands when she heard the bedroom door open, and then she saw Lord Melbourne enter the room. Her heart quickened. Lord Melbourne closed the door and walked slowly toward her. He looked nervous, too, and immediately he felt the fear that she was feeling. Lord Melbourne wore a long nightshirt, and long underpants like trousers. He spread his arms, as when one says "look at me," and he smiled amused. "I'm worse than that day at Dover House," exclaimed Lord Melbourne, making Victoria remember that day when she went to look for him in his office of Prime Minister without warning and surprised him in walking clothes at home, with which he worked in privacy, and both laughed that time. This time Lord Melbourne achieved his purpose of relaxing the atmosphere, and that she laughed, though nervous. Then he approached Victoria and put his hand on her shoulder, and felt her shudder. "Victoria, are you scared?" Lord Melbourne asked in a soft and low voice, while his other hand stroked Victoria's hair. "A bit, quite," Victoria answered in a broken voice. "Me too, Victoria. I mean, I see you as something so beautiful, so fragile, and I care about you so much, which I'm afraid of breaking you. For me it's new to feel this way. I've never been with a woman I love as much as you. Today you made me the happiest man in the world, you made me feel that I was born again. I love you. I want you, Victoria," said Lord Melbourne, looking into her eyes with intensity. "And I love you, Lord M," she said, touched. "Do you trust me, Victoria?" replied Lord Melbourne. "So much to give you my life," Victoria answered. "Then do not be afraid. I will not hurt you, my love. I'm going to be gentle." Then he bent down and kissed her lips, as he hugged her tightly. A soft, tender, but prolonged kiss. After a few moments that seemed eternal, he separated from her and saw her in the eyes, a look of passion, of longing. Then he bent down and quickly and firmly lifted her off the ground, and carried her into his arms. Victoria, taken by surprise, watched as her view passed from Lord Melbourne's face to the ceiling in moments, then back to his face as Lord Melbourne carried her like a baby. They both laughed. Lord Melbourne kissed her mouth as he carried her, and after pulling his lips away, Victoria buried her face in his chest. Then Lord Melbourne carried her to the bed and gently laid her on the feather mattress. He leaned back against Victoria and kissed her again on the lips, more passionately, leaving her breathless. She responded to his kisses energetically, and placed one of her delicate hands on the back of Lord Melbourne's head to draw him closer. Then he touched Victoria's breasts again, over the fabric of her nightgown, tightening her breasts. At one point, Lord Melbourne turned away from Victoria, and stood, still seeing her to eyes. Then he took off his shirt for his head, and left his torso bare, and Victoria admired his male chest, wide and strong. Then Lord Melbourne took off his underpants and was completely naked. Victoria's eyes widened and she looked rather comical when she saw that part of Lord Melbourne's body, erect. She felt her heart went out of her mouth, and she felt her whole body tremble with force. Lord Melbourne walked slowly over to her and stroked her face. "Victoria, can I take off your nightgown?" Lord Melbourne asked in a slow and seductive voice. With her eyes wide and a gesture on her face as if she were in shock, Victoria nodded her agreement. Lord Melbourne grabbed Victoria's nightgown and slowly took off it for her head, and she raised her arms to help with the task. Now she was also totally naked. Lord Melbourne toured the whole body of Victoria's naked body with his eyesight, beginning at her breasts and ending at her feet, then returning and focusing her gaze on Victoria's crotch. With his right hand, he began to draw a path, caressing Victoria's body since her shoulders, caressing her breasts, descending her belly, tracing the curves of her hips, tracing a path with his fingers through her crotch. Victoria trembled, and he felt it under his strong hand. He kissed her again on the lips, and spoke to her in whispers. "You have a beautiful body, Victoria, the body of an angel. I want to possess it, I want to taste it. I need to kiss every corner of your body, every inch of your skin," he said in a voice drowned by desire. Lord Melbourne's lips descended, kissing Victoria's neck, kissed the girl's neck again and again. Then he descended lower, and gently kissed the nipple of Victoria's breast, then with his tongue licked the nipple, tracing a path through her aureole. Then he grabbed her breast with one hand and stuffed the nipple into his mouth, sucking it slowly. Victoria closed her eyes and with one hand clung to Lord Melbourne's hair. Lord Melbourne sucked one of Victoria's breasts for a while, then left it to continue descending, and then he kissed the girl's belly. He continued descending and began to kiss the mons pubis of Victoria. Lord Melbourne did not stop, and soon his lips were scanning in a thick jungle. Victoria gasped and squirmed with her eyes closed, one hand clutching the bed sheets and the other on her husband's head. Lord Melbourne was exploring the holiest part of the body of Victoria, testing inside his mouth the taste of the intimacy of the young woman. Then, delicately so as not to hurt her, he put a finger in that intimate place. Victoria arched her back and clutched the bed sheets and his hair more tightly. Lord Melbourne checked the humidity in the warm cavity. He placed over her, and prepared to possess her. Slowly Lord Melbourne penetrated Victoria. Victoria shuddered again, clenched her teeth and, with her eyes closed, she made a gesture of pain in her face. Leaning on his elbows, Lord Melbourne was on top of her, penetrating her, to see her in the face. He stroked the girl's hair as he spoke in a low voice. "Did I hurt you?" asked Lord Melbourne, with sincere consideration for her. "No. It just hurts a little. But do not stop, please." Victoria opened her eyes to see him, tears streaming down her eyes and broken voice. "Victoria, for me your virginity is a gift. You make me crazy. If it hurts you, if you feel uncomfortable, tell me and I will stop," Lord Melbourne said, protectively and affectionately. "Thank you, but do not stop. I want you possess me," she replied, crying with nerves and joy at the same time. Lord Melbourne smiled and responded, slowly thrusting inside her. Victoria closed her eyes again and gritted her teeth in a new gesture of pain and pleasure. Lord Melbourne assaulted into Victoria's inside, backing away a little without leaving her body, then to strike again, with slow and gentle strokes, trying not to cause her much pain, almost rhythmically. Victoria clutched at him, like a shipwreck to a board, and she could not help nailing her nails into Lord Melbourne's back. He kissed her lips with passion and whispered tender words to her to calm her. Victoria opened her mouth and began to moan with pleasure, which rose in volume. Lord Melbourne rammed into inside Victoria's body with a little more force, causing her to scream louder. Until finally they both reached the climax. Lord Melbourne spilled his seed inside Victoria, with a manly lament of pleasure, and collapsed exhausted over her body. Victoria almost screamed at the last thrust, and then she felt an explosion of emotions inside her. Then she opened her eyes, staring at the ceiling, panting, breathing hard. A moment later, Victoria stroked Lord Melbourne's hair and back, and kissed him tenderly on the cheek, until he began to respond by kissing her on the lips. Then Lord Melbourne lay on his back, and drew Victoria into his arms, so she lay on him. Victoria leaned her head on Lord Melbourne's chest, as if it were a pillow. She caressed his chest, and with a finger drew circles the man's skin. "It is always so?" Victoria asked quietly. "In a positive or negative sense, ma'am?" replied Lord Melbourne jokingly, enjoying using one of the formal treatments with which he spoke to Victoria when his relationship was less personal and more formal. "Wonderful," she answered like a little girl excited to discover something new and exciting. "That depends on both, Victoria. For my part, I'm willing to always be," said Lord Melbourne, kissing Victoria's head above her hair. Victoria lifted her head a little and saw blood stains on the mattress cover. Then she saw the traces of blood on the inside of her thighs. Lord Melbourne followed with his own sight the view of Victoria. "It's normal, Victoria," said Lord Melbourne, ignoring that she knew about sex. "I know," she said, blushing, remembering her conversation with Scarrat. "If you want to know anything, ask me without any embarrassment," said Lord Melbourne, seriously. "After all, you are still young and inexperienced, and it is my job, no, it is my duty, to see that you come to no harm." He added in a mocking tone, using a phrase he had used at a crucial moment when he as Prime Minister tried to make that her as Queen do her duty and commission Peel to govern, and to avoid a crisis by refusing to accept the departure of her beloved Melbourne. She laughed, remembering that moment, and he too laughed. "You're a fool, Lord M," said Victoria, amused, then became shy again. "There's something, when you were inside me, is it supposed to be that big?" Lord Melbourne could not help but laugh. "Did I say something stupid?" Victoria asked in embarrassment. "No. No, my love," replied Lord Melbourne, with some tenderness at Victoria's innocence, "it's just that most men would generally consider it a compliment." "Seriously?" Victoria said a little astonished, and then she smiled amused. "Then I think I have praised you." "Sure. I love your body, Victoria, it's so beautiful," Lord Melbourne answered in a manly tone. "And you do not care if I'm small?" said Victoria. "When I began to fall in love with you, and I had to work with you as Prime Minister and your private secretary, whenever we had a meeting, I imagined what your body would look like under your clothes. How would you be naked?" Lord Melbourne said. "Lord M," Victoria exclaimed with laughter, scandalized and flattered at the same time. "How could I resist this?" he said, grabbing Victoria's breast, stroking and pressing it. "These breasts like apples, so divine, your skin so soft and delicate, your beautiful legs," he added, letting his hand slide to Victoria's leg, "and others so exquisite parts," he added, giving Victoria a sound, which made her startle and giggle. "I like you too," Victoria said, kissing Lord Melbourne's chest. "That's good to know, ma'am," he said amusedly. Victoria began to kiss Lord Melbourne's masculine chest, as before he had kissed her whole body. She was kissing her husband's chest again and again, trying to be seductive for the first time, as if it were a children's game. Lord Melbourne grabbed Victoria's hand and led her to that part of his body. Victoria shyly grabbed him, then was shocked to feel her hand a little sticky. Lord Melbourne explained with a smile that was it. By then Lord Melbourne was already excited again, and he grabbed Victoria and with energy turned her face up, and settled on top of her. "Victoria, open your legs," said Lord Melbourne with a tone of command he had never used with her. Victoria spread her legs and gave herself submissively, and he penetrated her again. She made a gesture of pain, but unlike the first time she opened her eyes and kept her eyes on her husband's eyes. "Say that you are mine," said, almost commanded her, Lord Melbourne as he rammed the inside of her. "I am," she said in a submissive tone. "I am your master, at least in this bed," he said with some amused irony. "In this bed you will submit to my wishes." I will be your slave, my lord," Victoria replied between gasps of pain and pleasure. "You will never deny me your body, this body that is now mine." "Say it," Lord Melbourne said, his voice choked with excitement and effort as he lunged harder. "I will never deny you. It is yours forever," she replied, panting louder, and nailed her nails into Lord Melbourne's back. "I want to own you all the days of my life," he exclaimed as he raged with rage, lost in the passion. "Oh God, "Have mercy on me!" she exclaimed, as her senses dissolved in the sweet surrender of the flesh. This time, when they finally reached the climax, Victoria screamed, and then, when they both caught their breath, they laughed like children and hugged each other, kissing. They continued talking and laughing, sharing kisses and hugs. He grabbed Victoria by the arms and drew her towards him. "Victoria, all I want is to love you for the rest of my life, is short or long, but I don't want to part with you. In every way," Lord Melbourne said with desire. Victoria looked down at Lord Melbourne's crotch and then looked up. "You're ready, again?" Victoria exclaimed with a nervous laugh and a comical expression on her face. "I am always prepared to honor my queen," exclaimed Lord Melbourne with an amused smile. They both laughed, and again they unite their bodies, to consummate the physical love again. The next morning, Victoria awoke from sleep, still totally naked. Her head was resting on Lord Melbourne's shoulder, and then she saw her husband, deeply asleep, lying on his back, and also totally naked. Victoria saw him with a smile and a wicked gesture of desire, her eyes sparkling. She stared at him for a while, then slowly, trying not to make a sound, she got out of bed and stood up. She looked for her nightgown, but she realized that it was under Lord Melbourne's body, and she had to restrain herself from laughing. Then she grabbed her robe and put it on, tying the loops around her waist. With her robe on and barefoot, she took one last look at Lord Melbourne, who was still sleeping soundly, and, smiling, went to the door and opened it. Scene 2. After Eliza left the bedroom, Victoria stood by the bed without knowing what to do. She was barefoot and was wearing only a long nightgown up to her ankles. Underneath her nightgown she had no other garment, and when she saw herself in a large mirror in a corner, Victoria realized that the nightgown was more transparent than she thought, and her nipples and pubic hair from her most intimate part were more or less visible. At that moment she heard the door open, and without turning around she knew it was Lord Melbourne, and her heart quickened. He approached her from behind, very slowly, and suddenly Victoria felt the warm breath of Lord Melbourne on the back of her neck. She shuddered as he put his big, strong hands on her shoulders. "You're trembling, Victoria," Lord Melbourne said in a sweet, reassuring voice, "and you're cold, too. Do not be afraid, please." "I'm not afraid, Lord M. William. If someone I should not be afraid of is you. It's my first time, and I cannot help being nervous." "I do not want to disappoint you," Victoria said, her voice cracked with emotion. "You can never disappoint me. Please let me show it, let me show you my love," Lord Melbourne answered in a suggestive voice. Victoria nodded, and then Lord Melbourne wrapped his arm around her waist. As he stood behind Victoria, he made her turn her head to kiss her lips. The kiss became more passionate, and then Victoria turned and Lord Melbourne embraced her without ceasing to kiss her. He was dressed in a nightshirt and long underpants, and in the middle of the embrace Victoria felt a hard bulge in Lord Melbourne's crotch. Still hugging and kissing, they both walked a few paces and fell on the bed. Lord Melbourne took Victoria's small body and placed it better on the bed, then settled on top of her, and continued to kiss her in the mouth, almost in a frenzy. Then he tossed Victoria's nightgown from one of the girl's shoulders and let him down, until he uncovered one of Victoria's breasts. Then Lord Melbourne began to suck on the breast, to suck with delight and frenzy the nipple of the chest, while with one hand tightened it. Victoria closed her eyes and raised her head, and the look on her face reflected a mixture of shame, nervousness, and pleasure. After, Lord Melbourne slid his hands over Victoria's body. She had one leg bent, her knee raised and her foot resting on the mattress, and Lord Melbourne's hand slid over that leg, pushing the fabric of her nightgown down, until he bare her leg to her hip. His anxious hand stroked her bare thigh, then rose to her knee. Lord Melbourne kissed her leg from thigh to foot, and then eagerly pulled Victoria's nightgown up to her waist, leaving Victoria's vagina naked. She trembled hard, kept her eyes closed and with one hand clutched the sheets. Lord Melbourne began stroking bushy bush of Victoria's pubic hair with the back of one hand, seeing the sex still unexplored of his lover with lustful desire. "It's the most beautiful and exquisite thing in the world," Lord Melbourne said in a manly voice, full morbid. Slowly he brought his face to Victoria's genitals, and kissed the hair that covered them. Delighting in the scent of his wife's sex, kissing her vagina again and again through the tangle of hairs, and timidly poking his tongue into the most hidden intimacy of the young woman. Then Lord Melbourne paused, to take off his nightshirt and strip off his underpants, while Victoria stared at him with narrowed eyes, and felt a strange emotion for her when she saw the male member erect. Lord Melbourne kissed Victoria's belly, stroked her breasts, kissed her lips. Then he gently opened her legs wider, placed himself in a position above the young woman, and slowly penetrated her. "Ah!" Victoria exclaimed with a pained expression on her face, and with her two small hands clung to Lord Melbourne's broad back, nailing her nails in a spontaneous gesture, and buried her face in his cheek. "I do not want to hurt you, my love. I just want to love you," whispered Lord Melbourne. "Do not let me go. Do not let go of me, William." "I love you," Victoria said, almost in ecstasy, her voice cracking with excitement and nerves. Lord Melbourne loved her with passion, almost with rage. He rammed into her, with his hard male member wounding the intimate cavity of Victoria, until then virgin. He sank his erect male member into her, as if he wanted to break her with him, while he kissed her in a frenzy. As if all the pain and frustration of so many years had become wild and irrepressible lust. Victoria's moans, her cries of pain and pleasure that were almost screams, excited Lord Melbourne much more. When he felt that he could not take much longer, Lord Melbourne sought Victoria's lips and kissed her passionately, just as he reached the climax and poured his seed into her, and a moment later Victoria uttered a loud moan, feel that she too reached the climax. They both looked up and laughed, with a giggle that expressed pleasure and almost childlike joy, and then they kissed each other on the lips as Victoria stroked his cheek. A few moments later they were both hugging each other, and Victoria kissed husband's bare chest. "Did you like Victoria?" asked Lord Melbourne, satisfied and genuinely interested. "They taught me that it was a sin for a woman to talk about sex, even with her husband, and that it was even more sinful for a woman to enjoy sex, even within marriage. Evidently my tutors or were maidens like Lazan, or they did not have a husband like mine," Victoria replied with a smile. "So what?" said Lord Melbourne jokingly. "I loved William, I loved it. I'm a little sore if you want to know, but I loved it," Victoria replied blushing. "That is because your virtue is no longer intact," Lord Melbourne replied mischievously. "No, I gave it to the man I love," said Victoria, touched and happy, as she came to kiss him. "But the night just begins, my dear wife, and this man wants much more," said Lord Melbourne maliciously as he pounced on her, with his erect member. "Oh my God! Oh, William!" exclaimed Victoria, losing herself in the lust in her husband's arms.